Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 26th of February 2025, just after 1 o'clock, and welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and joining me today in the studio is Charles Malet. And by video link, we have Sandi Adams and Clare Wills Harrison. We're going to begin with war spending because that was the big news of yesterday. And the great double cross of the British people by its own government continues. And we have the double cross here in this image. Following a statement to the House of Commons yesterday, Keir Starmer made a statement to the press to announce new war spending commitments, and he began by setting out a stall about the danger we all face because of Putin and Russia. So let's just have, if we can bear it, have a listen to this.
And I believe we must now change our approach to national security, so we are ready to meet the challenges of our volatile world. The reason for this is straightforward. Putin's aggression does not stop in Ukraine. Russian spy ships menace our waters. Russian planes enter our airspace. Russian cyber attacks hit our NHS. And just 7 years ago, there was a Russian chemical weapons attack in broad daylight on the streets of Salisbury.
So, I mean, if we can stop laughing for a second, that is an outright pack of lies. And as usual, mainstream press silent on the lies. Look, spy ships menacing our waters, when have they not done that? So here's just one example. In 2021, HMS Defender, a Type 45 destroyer from the Royal Navy, went to the Black Sea in what Russia described as Russia described us as a hostile NATO state. So HMS Defender traveled 6,000 miles to sail through what Russia considered territorial waters and what was absolutely, in my opinion, designed to be an act of provocation. But this is part of normal life. We do it. The United States does it. Russia does it. There's nothing to see here. And it's the same for Russian aircraft, which, by the way, never enter UK airspace. So that was just a downright lie from Starmer. But this kind of thing is absolutely routine. Even the BBC acknowledges that this is absolutely routine. As for the cybercrime allegation, again, Starmer is lying because he implies that Russian cyber attacks are state sanctioned. Well, if they are, then the Russian state is carrying out attacks against itself because Russia experiences huge levels of cybercrime by criminals based in Russia. And the latest stats here from AAG, or at least AAG have compiled them. The latest stats are from 2022, for example, and they're saying that in the Q1 of 2022, Russians experienced 42.92 million data breaches. Around 250,000 cases of digital fraud each year in Russia. And in Q3 of 2022, Russia was the top country in the world for cybersecurity breaches. So Russia does have a cybersecurity problem, but Starmer's implication that it's state sanction is absolutely unevidenced. And of course, that's not to say that there is no state-sanctioned cyber operations, but this is known as cyber warfare. And again, every country does it. And this is UK Defence Journal just pointing out that Britain is to boost its cyber warfare capabilities. And then finally, the biggest lie of all, the Salisbury poisoning. And my question once again is, where are the Skripals? Because, of course, in the recent Don Sturgis inquiry hearings, the Skripals were nowhere to be seen. They've been nowhere to be seen ever since. But if you want to see, once again, I'll mention it, just how full of holes the narrative is on this, the Skripal poisonings. Have a read of The Day of the Skripal on the UK Column website, because this story does not stack up from start to finish. Now, coming back then to Starmer's speech, let's listen to what he said when he was announcing the actual spending increase.
I know people have felt the impact of this conflict through rising bills and prices. But unless Ukraine is properly protected from Putin, then Europe will only become more unstable, and that will hurt us even more. Furthermore, the great lesson of our history is that tyrants like Putin only respond to strength. So today I have announced the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
So more lies, the biggest sustained increase in defence spending. What's he doing? He's taking it up to 2.5% from 2.3%. he's named an ambition to reach 3% during the next Parliament. So that's a commitment that he never has to meet, or possibly never has to meet. So this is really a nothing announcement. And as Starmer heads over to the United States tomorrow, I'm sort of wondering whether this will satisfy Trump. And of course it won't. But as Brian mentioned on Monday, the issue of recruitment, even if they do spend more money, the issue of recruitment is the big issue around this. And the likelihood of conscription is therefore the bigger issue, in my opinion. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's exactly where we're going with this. I mean, I'll be talking about this a little bit later in the programme, but you're absolutely right. Not only is there going to be an uplift in the cyber capability, or at least that's what they hope to guarantee by the new recruitment process, which is going to be a sort of one-size-fits-all process in that you apply just to the armed forces and then you get funneled off into whichever direction you're meant to be needed. But the point is the acceleration. This is being sped up by a significant factor so that people can be pushed through the system in a shorter time as 40 days, which is a massive reduction, and therefore means just steamrolling over all the sort of due process that should really be gone through, including a medical that appears to be just a digital affair. So it's absolutely absurd to think that you could put a credible force together by recruiting in such a way. But exactly like you say, I think this looks much more likely to be set up so that it is a mechanism by which people can be conscripted at very short notice. And then, you know, the way that Starmer speaks about this, very much like John Healey was, which played on the news last week, speaking as though the entire audience was born yesterday, and this concept of defence or national security is entirely novel. And first of all, I think actually for Keir Starmer, that really might be the case. He might genuinely think that is it, because he has not paid attention to it at all, evidenced by the fact that he is suggesting that things that are exactly like Mike describes, completely part and parcel of life for any armed force, are being conducted. But to what end? And to suggest that X means Y is frankly absurd, particularly given that the limitations on the engagement in Ukraine were set out quite clearly by Putin from the start and have been thereafter. So where is it exactly that he is determining that we are at threat from Russia?
On Monday, Brian was talking about the conscription issue, and he mentioned in passing General Sheriff. I can't remember how to Sheriff. Yeah. Richard Kemp also waded into that discussion. He was even suggesting that immigrants should be conscripted into the military. I mean, how irrational are these people becoming?
Well, I think that there is, I mean, mainly what underpins this is a sense of desperation and panic. I think for people who, like Richard Sheriff or Richard Kemp, that having had a career in the armed forces, I think their concern is that the organisation they once belonged to is falling apart, and they want to do something to reverse that trend. I think that is as much of a motivating factor in what they say as their apparent concern for what are being described as threats to national security. So I think that's why that comes out. I think there's a loss of objectivity because of their careers in the armed forces.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Okay, well, look, let's move on then. And we're going to do a section now on the legislation that's working its way through Parliament at the moment. And we're going to begin with the Crime and Policing Bill.
We are. And I should say at the outset, this is not going to be exhaustive because there is simply too much contained within it. But the Home Office and the Home Secretary have been turning out oblique references to this Crime and Policing Bill, which was laid before Parliament yesterday, but without giving any clear idea of what may be lurking within. So we see Yvette Cooper here, and the show notes will contain links to the government's own descriptions of what the bill aims to do and why they consider it necessary. The UK column will aim to point out some of the dangerous infringements upon liberty which appear to be proposed by it. So the Home Office says the bill will give police powers to enable them to reduce the abuse of women and girls and children, especially sexual abuse, and the dangers posed by artificial intelligence, though the government is keen to embrace it. Something of a contradiction there. Now, central to the provisions in the bill are the conflation of antisocial behaviour and terrorism, as though it is but one small leap from one to the other. Like the majority of government legislation in the modern era, the offences which are being described as being created are to be found in existing legislation, making this an example of the simple justification for the extension of police powers and intrusions into our lives. To illustrate this, the definition of antisocial behaviour concerns the causing of harassment, alarm and distress, which are the exact terms covered by sections 4 and 5 of the Public Order Act 1986. So I would put it that the reason for this is, or the reason that it's rehashed, is to justify a range of orders, one of which was mentioned some weeks ago, and that's the respect order, which may bind the subject to refraining from or committing to certain activities. Now, these are passed down by courts, but they may be applied for by a very wide spectrum of organisations, including among their number housing providers, the Environment Agency, Transport for London, and the National Health Service. So for this to be the case, the bar is set extremely low, and an order may be granted if, quote, the court is satisfied on the balance of probabilities that the respondent has engaged in or threatens to engage in antisocial behaviour, and the court considers it just and convenient to make the order for the purpose of preventing the respondent from engaging in antisocial behaviour, end quote. So this would be to make it legal to engage in tackling pre-crime or indeed thought crime, and it is illustrative that the words just and convenient are used, as such a measure could never really be described as necessary and reasonable, which should be criteria that do of course follow such interventions. To contextualise the suggestion of such powers, it should be pointed out that the Labour MP Mike Amesbury, who's currently serving a 10-week sentence for punching someone in the face, is still on full pay as a Member of Parliament and faces no formal sanction against holding that parliamentary appointment. Now, another area of many deserving very close scrutiny are the apparent confusion of powers of entry and powers of seizure, upon which the police could have conferred upon them, with a special regard to bladed articles here on screen. As it stands, Section 17 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984 confer powers of entry for police, specifically in pursuit of someone they're trying to arrest, but only if they believe, rather than suspect, that that person is on the premises. This also applies to the preservation of life or limb. But this new bill guarantees or grants warrantless seizure of bladed articles, as seen a moment ago on the screen. Now, this suggests that a constable who is lawfully on any premises finds on the premises an article which has a blade or is sharply pointed, a relevant article, and has reasonable grounds for suspecting that the relevant article would be likely to be used in connection with unlawful violence. So, subject to an awful lot of decision-making by the particular constable who may be on the premises. What muddies the waters here considerably is that it then goes on to say if there is no person on the premises, they must leave a record of what was seized in a prominent place on the premises. Now, this prompts the question, what exactly would a constable finding themselves on a premises, how would they be able to justify what can really only be described as a fishing expedition? And given what Idris Elba was saying recently about the banning of all knives, it's not really hard to see how circumstantial evidence could be gathered and indeed by exploiting this provision when attempting to build a case against somebody undesirable. If even kitchen knives may be considered as articles to be used in connection with the unlawful violence that's described. So the present situation is that police are bound to limit any search according to specific criteria, the most important of which is to look only for the object of the search. So this bill would completely change the situation, and it should be expected to be challenged in the strongest possible terms. Other areas of the bill do deal with children specifically and apparent measures to protect them, also we're told, which we'll unpack in due course. There's not really time for that today, but what I would like to draw your attention to is the predicted drifting of the definition of terrorism, even concerning people between the ages of 12 and 21. And under the heading of youth diversion orders, it's now introduced that serious harm may be taken to constitute terrorism, completing the move away from any sort of ideological basis for the action or the threat of action. Now, this is a direct exploitation of the Rudy Cabana case concerning the stabbing of children in Southport, and it follows the theme of using the tragic circumstances of families to introduce measures to strip away liberty. And recent examples just on screen now, Ronan's law, Martin's law, and Raneem's law are all very much emotionally charged with which to justify powers which had not previously been given serious consideration. So, I mean, in summary, there'll be much more to examine in this bill over the coming weeks, but certainly at this stage, making noise about these issues, and in particular, the ceding of liberties against offences that are already on the statute book is critical. So this bill looks very much like it is an exercise in going over offences that are already written down purely to allow police to conduct themselves in ways that have hitherto not been possible, and indeed to strip away liberty that really should be preserved.
Thanks, Charles. Let's move on then to the Public Authorities brackets Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. And this is a bill introduced to the UK Parliament on the 22nd of January 2025 by Liz Kendall, Labour Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And the bill's stated aim is to, quote, make provision about the prevention of fraud against public authorities and the making of erroneous payments by public authorities, about the recovery of money paid by public authorities as a result of fraud or error and for connected purposes. But this is yet another piece of legislation designed to enable state bulk data collection surveillance of the general public, as far as I can see. And as with the Data Use and Access Bill, which Sandi will be covering a little bit later, it's not to be separated from the recent announcement, in my opinion at least, in the UK, of the building of multiple new AI data centres, because it's only with the use of AI that this huge bulk data collection becomes useful. So with us to discuss this legislation is Clare Wills-Harrison from Lawyers of Light. So Clare, welcome to the programme. And let me just begin by asking you what your thoughts are on the overreach, or does this bill overreach, in fact?
Absolutely. Does it overreach? There's an awful lot in this bill that we're not going to be able to cover today. There's expanded powers suggested for the DWP to be able to go and search premises and confiscate items. There's a crossover with what Charles has just been talking about, because there's already powers that exist that make this bill unnecessary. And really, it's just an enabling tool as far as I can see. It's bad on the face of it. There's around 7 or 8 Henry VIII clauses in that will allow for extensive amendments further down the line if this bill becomes law. So, yeah, I've really been taking a closer look at it for the last few weeks. And just to give a little bit of background to viewers, the bill in its current form will give the Secretary of State the power to issue something called eligibility verification notices, or EVNs for short, to banks and other financial institutions. Now, these notices will allow the authorities to access people's bank account data, but not because there's any suspicion of fraud. It's simply to help identify eligibility and or potential overpayments of benefits. There is absolutely no need for any criminal activity or evidence of wrongdoing before this happens. So the worrying thing about this is that all welfare claimants and, crucially, the people connected to them will have their accounts scrutinised by the government. Now, of course, banks are going to use AI to carry out these mass searches if they receive an EVN. And that means that they effectively have to process the data for every account holder at the bank, not just those receiving benefits. So it's a massive invasion of privacy for all of us, a serious risk for data breaches. And in addition, banks are actually going to charge for this processing. Now, it's unclear from the bill where these charges will be paid from, but it is clear that taxpayers will foot the bill. Now, that's either going to be from recovered funds or from the welfare or the DWP budgets. And I would just like to remind people, so that it's very clear, that when the government talk about welfare fraud and public money, they are talking about our money, the taxpayers' money. It is not their money, yet we don't get a say in how that's recovered. So, interestingly, The bill includes a clause, and I think people probably know about this already, but I'll just mention it, that it could strip drivers of their driving licences if they are convicted of benefit fraud and unable to repay the money. It's a real step too far. And obviously, there's a real danger that people could be convicted due to AI errors and lose their licence unfairly. We only have to look back at the Horizon scandal to see how it can all go so horribly wrong with machine learning and machine scraping and AI. So what I would like people to ask themselves about this bill, if they can take a look at it, and there'll be a link in the show notes, is it in fact really about fraud recovery at all? And if they read about all the issues connected with the bill and they still conclude that they think it's about fraud recovery, at what price is it going to achieve its aims? Because in a nutshell, this bill is all about the government having access to the private data contained in everyone's bank accounts by way of mass spying. So if that sounds familiar to viewers, it should. You might remember the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, and that proposed similar bank spying powers and raised widespread alarm about revealing data on people's medical conditions, movements, opinions, charitable donations, political donations. And of course, that bill fell in 2024 when Parliament was prorogued after being heavily criticised by the opposition government at the opposition at the time, the Labour Party, who are now in government. But of course, these invasive powers that we saw in that bill have now resurfaced in the Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. So at the heart of the bill is not fraud recovery. It's a massive data grab and the installation of a surveillance state. It's allowing the government to spy on personal bank information. It's completely disproportionate. It violates the right to privacy under the Human Rights Act. And as I said, the government already have existing powers to investigate welfare fraud under the Social Security and Fraud Act. It makes this bill totally unnecessary. Now, viewers can check out an article that I did this week on my Substack for further information about this bill. I highlighted 17 points that I was concerned about. And I'd also recommend that they do go and visit Big Brother Watch, who campaigned on the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, and then have regrouped to campaign now on the Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. And they've actually got a briefing document that comes up with 29 points about which we should all be worried. So you can join their campaign. They do have a petition. They do have a template letter to write to an MP for your MP for what it's worth. All of the links for that will be in the show notes. And obviously we need to stay informed on this particular issue and ensure that our privacy remains protected. There is a short video that I've got to show you all about what some MPs are saying about this particular bill. So take a listen, see what you think.
This is mass surveillance.
It is far too much of a snooper's charter.
These are citizens, not suspects.
These powers allow the Department for Work and Pensions to seize money directly from bank accounts without due process, suspend driving licenses and even search properties and personal devices. These are not the hallmarks of a free and democratic society, but the tools of an Orwellian surveillance state.
It is far too much of a Big Brother bill. It is far too much of a snooper's charter, and I would suggest to the Minister that they withdraw this bill. Thank you.
I'm very concerned about the sweeping powers of this bill to invade their privacy and treat them as suspects, not citizens. I'm talking about pensioners who need pension credit, people who are permanently disabled, who's entitled to employment support allowance is clear and settled. These are citizens, not suspects.
How much testing has been done of the systems they expect to use? The Horizon scandal is a very recent reminder of how computer systems don't always get it right.
When more than 200,000 people were wrongly accused and investigated for housing benefit fraud and error last June.
We should be concerned about making banks the judge, juries and executioners of social policy, particularly something as important as welfare policy.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with everything that was said there. So there are some MPs that are alive to the overreach that is contained in this bill. I am doing a follow-up article today with a breakdown of what seems to be the very limited revenue that is likely to be recouped if this bill becomes law. The figures are absolutely staggering, and I will only say you have to read it to believe it.
Claire, that is fantastic. Thank you very much for that. The subject is not so fantastic, of course, and the comment about the comparison with Horizon, I think, is absolutely valid, and we're already seeing, as corporations use more AI and more sort of automated systems. We're already seeing decisions being made that are very, very hard to challenge. I mean, from a legal point of view, do you think that this is going to end up in the courts?
I'm hoping that the bill will just not come into legislation. I mean, one of the big areas that there's a massive problem with wherever AI is involved is where is the liability when there is a mistake? Who does it rest with? Is it the person that created the system that's being used, that is using the system to do it? Who is liable? It's not, yourself, when there's a person involved that could be liable, then that's okay. But who is it when it's artificial intelligence? When it goes wrong, who do you sue? Where does the money come from if there's damages due?
These are all good questions. So I would say thank you very much.
We should just point out that a link to Clare's project, Legislation Watch, will go into the show notes, so you can read exactly what she's been talking about and what's going to be coming down the line from her Legislation Watch.
Yes, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Charles. Now, let's welcome Sandi to the programme then. And another piece of legislation, the Data Use and Access Bill. We've talked about it many times, and Claire was just, Sandi, talking about its precursor under the previous Tory government. And of course, although some of the features of that previous legislation have moved into the legislation that we've just been talking about, the Data Use and Access Bill covers a lot of the same ground. So this is not really an example of change, of the change agenda, as far as I can see, other than we're speeding things up.
Really, in January, that we managed to literally kick the Climate and Nature Bill down the road a little bit. It's now going to be reviewed in July, I believe. Even though it did have the support of about 1,700 very powerful supporters, so due to public concern, and I think people contacting their members of parliament who would listen, I mean, there are some good members of parliament who did oppose this enough for it to be put back till July. But we're constantly playing this game of whack-a-mole, and the latest mole that deserves a huge whack is this Data Use and Access Bill, which has now gone through several stages. It's and it's now in the House of Commons I think it's at the committee stage. It's a 270-page government, bill, which is a lot to read. Actually, it's a massive amount to read, and it's been snuck in under the radar. And it's a massive power grab of our data. Peter Kyle is the MP that's pushing it. He's the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation, Technology, and is a champion cheering on the potential loss of your privacy and freedom. He says that we have an outdated approach to data, which is holding Britain's economy back, and this bill will take the brakes off unleashing a new era of wealth and opportunity for all. Well, is it really? I mean, it's completely the opposite, really, because it might benefit the very few at the top, who are selling all this data on, but the life for all of us will be pretty much a digital prison where we'll be effectively spied on for eternity. If passed, this bill could change all of our lives, the lives of our children, grandchildren, forever. I mean, it's quietly slipping effortlessly through our legislative process, whilst we're all distracted, obviously, with the media circus that's going on right before our very eyes. It's huge government overreach, and taking a deeper look at it, it means implementing legislation that could fundamentally change how data is accessed, stored, and used without genuine public consultation or awareness. It's already been through the House of Lords, and it's only just got 3 stages before it reaches royal assent. So it's almost there. And it's setting a dangerous precedent for mass surveillance, erosion of privacy, and the automatic assumption that all our digital footprints belong to the government and corporate stakeholders, basically. So nothing is private anymore. One of the most alarming aspects of this bill is its retrospective data access provisions. Unlike previous data laws that required a specific justification for data collection, this one grants the government access to historical data that predates the law itself, which is unbelievable. So, everything that you've done in the past, every transaction, financial transaction you've ever made, everything you've ever looked at online, your health data, your financial data, everything can be scrutinized from the past. So, if you thought it was private before it existed, this will now be fair game for scrutiny, storage, and monetization. I mean, all of this is clearly, it's a new currency. Data is the new gold, as we know. This is why these big data centers are popping up all over the place. This is the new currency, the new gold. This level of government overreach contradicts basic privacy principles and puts UK people under permanent digital surveillance. And once the data is accessible, there's no real safeguards preventing any kind of misuse of it. So one of the most deceptive elements I find of this bill is the claim that removing cookie consent pop-ups will somehow benefit us by reducing consent fatigue, they call it. The government presents this as a benefit or convenience, making it appear as though they're sparing users from the clicking through consent permission requests. However, in reality, it's designed to eliminate the ability for you to refuse the data collection. And they use this term consent fatigue. I mean, that's quite chilling, actually. It's almost as though you're so tired of giving your consent. Just take my data and do with it what you like. I'm just a faceless number in your ever-growing data set. I mean, it's unbelievable. Under these new rules, websites and third-party stakeholders would no longer need explicit consent to track users. Your browsing habits, preferences, location, financial transactions, and biometric data would become, default assets openly shared across corporate and governmental networks. The idea is that this is a public service, and it's not just misleading; it's Orwellian. There's so many abuses. The role in future stakeholder capitalist systems, which they're trying to bring in, the CBDC and the digital currency. All of this is there for them to take, and it's a world where, our credit score will be coming into play. And as if we needed more evidence that Starmer is cozying up with the EU, it aligns perfectly with the EU digital identity laws. Because when we left the EU, we didn't automatically, we're not subjected to their data control laws that they're pushing on all the 27 other countries. So we're supposed to be free of all that, but instead our own government is aligning with Brussels under this UK-branded version of it. So it paves the way for data to be weaponized against the people. Unbelievable. So, what can we do? Well, we can demand transparency. We can appeal to, for whatever good it will do, appeal to our MPs. I think we have to also really, in our own sovereign way, are we consenting to this? I don't know how that works. What we've got to do is raise awareness about it. And I have created a template, which hopefully will be in the show notes, to send to your MPs, because it did bide us more time with the CAN bill, and I believe there are good people in Parliament. If we don't push back now, the UK's data framework could become one of the most intrusive and authoritarian in the Western world. Privacy isn't necessarily about what you have to hide; it's what can they use it against you? Can they use it against you? And this is what we have to ask ourselves. And it's a very, very pernicious act and bill. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandi. And of course, I've hinted or said the words in the past that we as individuals are being farmed by corporates and increasingly by the state as well. And data is very much, as you say, becoming a currency. This legislation, just enables the free export of whatever they choose to other countries as well. There are massive implications for it, as you say, and we'll be talking much more about that in Extra, I've no doubt. But look, let's move on. Thank you very much to everybody that is helping the UK column keep going. We do need your ongoing support. So if you are able to make a donation or join as a member, support.ukcolumn.org is the place to go for that. Or if you go to the UK column shop, you can pick something up there. And if you pick something up from clivetocarl.com, if you're into health products, we do get a small commission from anything that you pick up there, so long as you use that link. But please, if you can't do any of that, please do at least share the material that we provide, because that is how we get around the censorship regime. Now, another reminder of a date for your diary, Saturday the 5th of April 2025, UK column on location in Cheltenham. We do encourage as many people as possible to come to this. It's going to be a fantastic day, Charles.
It is indeed. And in actual fact, it bears very close relation to a lot of what we're discussing today, which on the face of it is parliamentary legislation. But of course, it is all influenced from elsewhere and indeed will benefit organisations elsewhere. And the theme for our event is going to be the machinations of the deep state. So I really would encourage you to consider that and its significance upon your life and join us for what will be an incredible day.
Absolutely. Catherine Gunn, of course, a whistleblower, ended up in court.
Yep. Absolutely. And more speakers to announce, but obviously Alex Thompson and Patrick Henningsen there as well.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Charles. Now let's, yesterday's interview was Brian speaking to Iolanda. And so this is the next in the series, Child Snatching by the State. And he's speaking to Iolanda about her experience of having a newborn baby taken from her and the bullying from state-sanctioned organisations. If you didn't see that yesterday, please do have a look at it. And tomorrow at 1 p.m, we've got an interview with Kathy Mudge. So Diane speaking to Kathy. She is founder and member of protectteach.co.uk, and they are talking about the work they are doing with schools and libraries to expose various agendas, including the trans agenda, making the way into those organisations. And they're also discussing a range of other organisations and how they're working within the school system. So that's at 1 p.m. tomorrow, if you possibly can. Now, let's come back, Charles, onto sort of war matters and, well, related matters anyway, because, of course, the deal has been done in Ukraine to start digging the place up. I know that it's been blown up. Maybe that helps with the digging later on. I don't know.
It may do, if indeed anyone can actually work out what it is they're going to be digging for. We hear that Donald Trump has raised eyebrows and a certain amount of consternation by suggesting that he has struck a deal for rare earth elements with Ukraine. But as asked by Argus, the bizarre case of Ukraine's rare earths here in a piece, really the question to be asked is that what he meant? Or was he talking about minerals in general? There's no open source evidence to suggest that there is in fact $500 billion worth of such elements in Ukraine, which does not say that it's not the case. Something that is worth pointing out, though, is that Ukraine is reckoned to have around 500,000 tons of lithium to be extracted. And when one considers the influence that Elon Musk, the owner and chief executive of Tesla, has as an interest in the operations of the US government and indeed his company, that may be relevant. But I think more than that, it sets context for the United Kingdom's involvement. And when one thinks that the UK, at the moment, despite its critical minerals strategy, suggesting that it doesn't actually produce any commercial grade lithium. And even when it does, the aim will be for tens of thousands of tons, certainly nothing of that scale. On the rare earth element side of it, it is considered that Ukraine does have a substantial amount of moissanite, which is a requirement for AI platforms to be able to run. So whether that may have some bearing on it is yet to be determined. But what it does seem to explain, as discussed a little bit earlier, but really the rush from Keir Starmer to get to Donald Trump's side, and indeed Starmer's and Macron's assertion that they will be putting peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine, despite the batting to one side of that notion by Sergei Lavrov. But it seems to expose the true purpose of the intervention in Ukraine. We've talked a lot about the reconstruction effort and indeed the corporate gains from putting on a proxy war in order that you can hoover up afterwards and go in for the reconstruction effort. But this looks like getting troops on the ground will really be to preserve the interests of the mineral extraction, if such a thing is going to come to pass. Now, what I would like to point out is that it's all very well these discussions going ahead, and indeed they would not be under a UN banner, but that's specifically because, as far as the United Nations is concerned, a peacekeeping operation requires the consent of all parties. And as I refer to, Lavrov is certainly not minded to give such consent. Another thing that I would like to point out, which refers back to Mike's segment earlier in the programme, is that the British Army's commitment to what's called Op Interflex, here an advertisement shown from Soldier magazine in April 2024, which was drawing and still continues to draw manpower away from the United Kingdom's focus on training and the supposed threat from Russia or Iran or wherever it is this week. But it is really worth pointing this out if we are to consider that we are at threat of being invaded or attacked by means other than simply cyber warfare. Is that really credible? Now, what seems incredible is the response I got from the Ministry of Defence when I put a Freedom of Information request in asking about the training of Ukrainian troops under Op Interflex. And specifically, I had asked what units the troops had come from and what audit trail was kept. They have replied saying that with regard to Op Interflex, the data held by Op Interflex headquarters is limited due to the closed nature of the questions which are asked when Ukrainian troops arrive, and we do not specifically track or ask which units individuals come from. Now, this is quite an extraordinary omission or admission from the Ministry of Defence, particularly given the amount of aid that is being provided to Ukraine, both in terms of lethal and what's called non-lethal aid. The sheer bill the taxpayer is footing is incredible. But the summary really is that we have absolutely no idea what effect this training is having. So we don't know where the money's going. We don't know if there's any success on the battlefield of those that are reckoned to have been trained under Op Interflex. There's absolutely no accountability. And moreover, we have no idea who these people actually are. So it does, of course, make it entirely possible that the neo-Nazi membership of the Azov Battalion, seen here at the Reform Club with the destroyer of peace, Boris Johnson, is being trained by the British Army. We don't know. I mean, it cannot certainly be said that that is not the case. It also raises the possibility that members of the Ukraine Foreign Legion may be being trained by the British Army. And this is a still from video taken by the headmaster of a private school from the Ukraine border. It's advertising the Foreign Legion as though it's some kind of computer game. Free your fury is the slogan. Now, it's attracted a number of Brits, of course, some of whom are known to have died, all of whom were encouraged to join up by Liz Truss. Here's the website of the Legionnaires. But such joining, certainly from a British citizen, would be an offence under the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1870, which is just another piece of legislation that the judiciary, executive and legislature of this country continue to ignore. But to follow what Brian was reporting on Monday, and as referred to earlier, the manpower statistics are not painting an encouraging picture. At 1st of October 2024, you can see that a clear trend indicates that recruitment is very much losing the battle against retention, with the Army's recorded strength at just 74,000. And I think the question to be put now, with or without conscription, is how long would elements of such a force last if on the ground in a direct engagement with Russia or Iran, or indeed anybody else?
Thank you, Charles. Now let's come back to more legislation. And of course, we've been reporting on the implications of the Investigatory Powers Amendment Act since well before it gained royal assent last September. But as a reminder, it amended the so-called Snoopers Charter to enable even more data collection and surveillance of the general public by our democratic regime. It enables a surveillance free for all by the security services. We can say goodbye to privacy and so on, but it also places huge limitations on the ability of tech companies to provide us with any kind of useful security or control over our own data when we use their devices. And worst of all, it prevents tech companies from disclosing that government has been making any kind of backdoor to use our data, or that they've received any kind of request for access to data that's held on their systems. Again, because we live in a democracy. And as we reported last week, the UK regime has taken Apple to court to force them to remove the end-to-end encryption facility provided by their iCloud data storage platform. Now, Apple has decided to comply with this by removing the facility from UK customers. And they say, we are gravely disappointed that the protections provided by Advanced Data Protection will not be available to our customers in the UK, given the continuing rise of data breaches and other threats to customer privacy. Now, while this is not surprising, I'm going to say it's pretty pathetic by Apple that they've taken this decision. It could be argued that had Apple not complied, they would have been required to create a backdoor, not just for users in the UK, but for people around the world, regardless of whether they were UK citizens or not. But the question now, for me at least, is what are WhatsApp and Samsung going to do, because they have similar end-to-end encryption practices in place. So we're going to have to wait and see what they do. But that is perhaps a disappointing decision by Apple to do it this way. And maybe they felt that they had no choice, but we'll talk a bit more about that in Extra as well. Sandi, let's come back to you then. And gun control, because the issue of farmers' access, the right to use shotguns, is something which is coming under increasing pressure once again.
Yes, I had a big chat with a few farmers down in Devon recently, and they had a few very major concerns about all of this. Firstly, just to put you in the picture, the government funding for the Farming Resilience Fund has been cut. It's a fund that supported mental health charities in the agricultural sector. With the inheritance tax changes in the Labour budget, many older farmers are now in a position where if they die, it's awful really, if they die before April 2026, then whoever they pass their farm on to won't have the estate valued under the new inheritance tax rules. And frankly, I mean, this is a very dark thought, but it's putting pressure almost to older farmers to possibly contemplate taking their own lives before April 2026, which is absolutely horrible. They for fear of they've built up their farms over decades, sometimes centuries, and they've got the notion of it being portioned off and sold to survive, potentially becoming unviable in that process. So we have to look at the old Hegelian dialect coming into play, problem, reaction, solution. This is where we get onto the current gun laws and restrictions being imposed on farmers, because the scrutiny on their mental health could deter farmers from seeking mental health support for fear of losing their firearms as well. The UK has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, and these laws have obviously evolved incrementally over time, and significantly impacting British farmers at the same time. They rely on their firearms, primarily shotguns and rifles, for pest control and livestock management. But successive firearm restrictions have made it increasingly difficult for them to own and use guns for legitimate agricultural purposes. Really from 1920, when the Firearms Act came in, and then 1968, it was amended, and tighter controls on gun licensing. With firearm certificates for rifles and pistols, and shotgun certificates for smoothbore shotguns. This act introduced the good reason requirement for owning a firearm, which meant farmers had to justify why they needed one. However, pest control and agricultural use were still valid reasons then. And then in 1988, we had the Firearms Amendment because of the Hungerford massacre, when 16 people sadly were shot by a legally owned firearm. And new restrictions were introduced, and they banned semi-automatic rifles and pump-action rifles over 2.2 .22 calibers. So farmers could no longer use semi-automatic rifles for pest control, making rabbit and fox control more difficult. Then in 1997, we had the Dunblane massacre, where handguns were almost entirely banned in the UK. And farmers who previously used handguns for humane animal dispatch had to switch to captive bolt guns or single shot pistols, which require special licensing anyway. And this made humane dispatch more bureaucratic and difficult in emergency situations. So again, in 2016, more amendments imposed because of the post-terror attacks in Europe. And then in 2020 and to 2023, tighter shotgun licensing and police discretion was imposed because of the Plymouth shooting in 2021. So all of this has just been incremental. It's just kind of like made it more and more difficult. So farmers now face stricter scrutiny with greater emphasis on mental health checks, and the tightening of UK gun laws has generally followed major criminal incidents or public outcry. And some police forces have been arbitrarily revoking shotgun licence, even for minor concerns, making it hard for farmers to retain their firearms. The latest tightening of shotgun laws is making it harder for farmers to access and retain shotguns, which could have serious consequences for agriculture. There's an increased bureaucracy and cost for them, more paperwork, medical assessments. Police oversight means that general costs for farmers, or when they're already under financial pressure. You've got lambing. Sometimes they need the shotguns for protecting the lambs during lambing from foxes and other predators. So it's difficult. The current trends are that farmers could face severe difficulties in obtaining or keeping shotguns, which are essential tools in rural life. And there's a growing concern that bureaucratic overreach and arbitrary revocations could harm both individual farmers and the broader agricultural industry. The rural firearms sector is being very, very divided on this, and it's quite clever the way they've done it. The one farmer described it to me as first they came for the semi-automatic rifles, but the clay pigeon shooters said, I only shoot clay pigeons and with a shotgun, so I'm not going to worry about it. And then they came for the handguns, but the deer hunters use bolt-action rifles, so they weren't worried. And then they came for the bolt-action rifles, but the game shooters shoot game birds with shotguns, so they weren't worried. And now they're coming for the shotguns, so they're going to have nothing and no one to fight this as they're all divided. To be honest, the UK, had a society in which widespread licensed gun ownership was the norm. There's no provable link between the further tightening of gun rules and the reduction in crime. Quite the opposite. And since these restrictions, gun crime has actually soared, out of control, regardless. Criminals will obtain guns regardless of the law. And it's not as though farmers have been irresponsible historically with their guns. The current discussion surrounding further restricting shotgun ownership is further evidence to the thought that the farmer represents kind of an uncontrolled power to the in the populace, and access to guns, is an equaliser. It's something that the government wished to be removed at worst, and heavily controlled at best. We have to ask ourselves, from the perspective of governments trying to enact a land grab at the moment, is it in their interest to make sure that the current landowner isn't armed? We've got to ask this question.
Sandi, I would add, the question is, are they worried if they turn up to slaughter your chickens or your cattle if under the circumstances, if you're armed, and that maybe takes us very neatly onto bird flu?
It does, unfortunately so, yes. The UK column has covered in great detail the lead-in to what is being described as an epidemic of avian influenza across the UK. And the area that I'm going to focus on today is the mass slaughter of poultry in response. But the question which must be asked at the outset is whether this response is proportionate and necessary, even by the government's own metrics and legislation. Now, in response to a Freedom of Information request and a media inquiry from the Animal and Plant Health Agency and the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, respectively, confirmed that over 2 million captive birds have now died. The language used is to infer that this is in large part due to illness, but the most recent statistics from the government, updated on Monday, confirm that just 41 cases of avian flu have been recorded. If you recall the mass slaughter of 2001 ascribed to the prevention of the spread of foot and mouth, or you've watched the UK column documentary Slaughtered on Suspicion, you may not be quite so surprised to learn that this means the government is now killing more than 48,000 birds each time they confirm a case via PCR test. In the words of its inventor, Carrie Mullis, PCR may not be used as a diagnostic test, posing the very significant question, is the government cull lawful or does it constitute malfeasance? The extraordinary powers which enable the government to do this come from Section 5 of Schedule 3 to the Animal Health Act 1981, which I'll now run through. Quote, the minister may, if he thinks fit, cause to be slaughtered any diseased or suspected poultry. Any poultry which are or have been in the same field, pen, shed, or other place as, or otherwise in contact with, diseased poultry, or which appear the minister to have been in any way exposed to the infection of disease, or any poultry the Secretary of State thinks should be slaughtered with a view to preventing the spread of avian influenza or Newcastle disease. With regard to the element of risk or threat to public health, the Freedom of Information request, or the response to it, makes clear that this is not even a consideration. Despite holding stocks of 5 million doses of a human vaccine against bird flu, none has been administered to those employed in the process of destroying or handling these birds, nor has APHA any record at all of anyone expressing any symptoms of a human variant of what they're calling bird flu. So skewed is the process that the government finds what it wants to find, and the minister may destroy livestock on that basis. And I should reiterate that APHA and DEFRA confirm again that no other tests are conducted, which means that there's no investigation into the possibility that a toxicity of some other kind has been introduced into the environment. It's also worth noting that 85% of the birds slaughtered so far have been permanently housed. And as referenced previously, this completely negates the biosecurity countermeasure of keeping birds indoors. The video that you've just been watching is from a few years back, and it's essentially a propaganda piece from the BBC on how birds love to be kept indoors, completely on top of one another. But one hardly needs to contrive the existence of a disease such as bird flu in order to explain why birds like those you've just seen might not be healthy. And if you are buying poultry meat from a supermarket, this is where it comes from. The average lifespan of a bird there being just 42 days due to the use of growth hormones. Now, away from poultry sheds, the annual NFU conference has just taken place, where the focus remains resolutely on the subject of inheritance tax, to the exclusion of a raft of other issues which beset farmers. Steve Reed, the Environment Minister, insists he wants farms to be profitable, while simultaneously forcing many of them into complete reliance on government handouts. And in order to produce anything but food, a farming profitability unit is to be established. And as the image, we can just pop that image back on screen, as this image shows, the only pathway towards such profitability is reckoned to be through technology, the inference being that small farms, for whom such investment is unrealistic, are not a consideration in the future corporatisation of the countryside. And given the bird flu situation and the fact that the Chief Vet's previous role was to unleash the Biosecurity Act in New South Wales, Australia, it is significant that Reid speaks of changes to the APHA operation in Weybridge to bring in a new National Biosecurity Centre. This just looks like a thinly veiled mechanism by which to destroy all small-scale livestock operations in order that the supermarket cartels and the fake food manufacturers assume control of absolutely everything we eat. But finally, a break in the clouds, metaphorically at least, with the news and, of course, accompanying outrage that BP is to row back on its commitment to so-called renewables in order that it reverts to concentrating on its core business in oil and gas. Now, whilst this will be played down, it's a very strong indication of how the net zero scam is underpinned. The only reason that corporate entities have gone along with the net zero narrative is because they could make money out of it. Their responsibility, though, is to their shareholders and not to the ever more spurious science laid before us. If you are aware of other organisations reneging on similar pledges, please do get in touch, as these are exactly the sorts of development which will help see the scale of the climate. Help people see the scale of the climate change fraud. Now, going back to the theme of bird flu, do stay tuned for Extra, as I'm going to give an account of an organic poultry farmer in Devon to whom I've spoken just yesterday. Emma Saunders believes that her business will not recover after the destruction of all of her poultry birds, and that was even after the ministry confirmed that 4,000 of them were perfectly healthy, but they were destroyed nonetheless.
Fantastic. I mean, it's just no lessons have been learned from 2001, and it's just incredible how this continues. But on
the contrary, I think plenty of lessons have been learned. I think something we can go into in Extra is the compensation scales. And the push. I mean, if we look at farm holdings, I don't have the figures with me, but if we look at how many farm holdings there were in 2001 versus how many there are now, and how much land is in corporate control, I think they've absolutely learned their lesson.
Right. Okay.
Just the wrong lesson for us.
Indeed. Okay, we will talk more about that in Extra. Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you to Sandi and to Clare Wills-Harrison for joining us today. We've got to finish there. Do join us in a few minutes for Extra. Otherwise, watch the interview at 1 p.m. tomorrow, and we will see you on for another news program at 1 p.m. on Friday as usual. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.